over the last few weeks, I have been having some conversations with some people about Night Church and their hopes and dreams and what they would like to see in the service. I'm really open to having that conversation with you too. If you'd like to have that conversation, I'll put my phone number on the screen here. Send me a message. We'll have a quick chat and you can share with me some of your ideas as well. One of the comments that has come back to me is that some people are saying they wouldn't mind doing some exegesis preaching, digging a little bit deeper into a particular book or text or passage of the Bible. And so as a bit of a taster to see if this is something that lots of people are looking for, I'm going to tonight just invite us to dip our toes into the book of Hebrews. Not necessarily to go through it line by line, but rather to get our head around where is this book of Hebrews coming from. We've just heard the first chapter of the book of Hebrews, and let's be honest, did you understand that? It is full of quotes, left, right and centre from the Old Testament. Quotes like, "Let angels worship God, God makes his servants flames of fire, we are anointed with oil of joy," and ends with the question, "Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who inherit salvation?" Yikes! What do we do with something like that? Where do we even begin to try and understand a passage like Hebrews 1? Well, I could start at verse 1 and just work through line by line and try and explain each line. But I think when it comes to something like the book of Hebrews and a number of other books of the Bible, sometimes it's actually more helpful to take a step back before we even start going through line by line and to look at the context of the book. Because if we don't understand where Hebrews is coming from, then we might miss what the verses are trying to say within Hebrews. The reason I chose Hebrews is that Hebrews is a good example of what contextual theology is all about. Now, contextual theology is when you take a theological concept or a spiritual idea and reword it or reshape it in such a way that it makes more sense to a particular group of people or makes more sense in a particular situation. Overseas missionaries do this all the time. They have to explain the concept of Jesus and the good news of Jesus and theological concepts like Jesus is both human and divine and the concept of salvation and how we get right with the creator of the universe. They've got to take these spiritual concepts, but then they need to explain it to people who have no idea what the missionaries are talking about. I remember as a teenager hearing a story of a missionary who went to Papua New Guinea and was trying to share the gospel with an unreached tribe. And he learnt the language okay, but trying to explain the story of Jesus he was finding it an impossible task. They just was not getting this idea of how God could come a baby and then how this baby could grow up and die on a cross so that somehow our sins would be forgiven. They couldn't get it. They just could not get what this missionary was trying to say. And this missionary was getting more and more frustrated with the fact that he couldn't work out how to share this message. But then he heard them sharing a story of their history, this tribe. And this story goes on that many years beforehand, this particular tribe was in a war with another tribe. And this nearby tribe that they were in war with, many people were being killed. And this war went on, this conflict went on for generation after generation. And there seemed to be no way of stopping this. And then one day, the two chiefs of the two tribes came together in an effort to try and find some sort of peace. And the way that they did that is that each one of the chiefs took their young child and gave it to the other chief to be brought up by the other chief's family in the other chief's village. This amazing act of sacrifice brought about the ending of the war. And when the missionary heard this story, he goes, I've got it. That's how I can explain the gospel. Because he went on to say that God the Father is like those two chiefs. wanting to bring about an end to conflict. And he did that by giving his own son to the world. Jesus was the sacrificial child. And being able to explain the gospel using a story of their own, suddenly this tribe got what the missionary was trying to say, because he used a story from their own context to explain the story of Jesus and the cross. Is this making sense? I hope so, because this is the whole idea of contextual theology. In understanding something like the book of Hebrews, you need to understand the context and the people that this was written to. You see, the writer of the book of Hebrews wrote the letter to a very specific group of people in a very specific context. Well, the title gives it away. He wrote it to the Hebrew people. And the book has a very clear and dominating Jewish context to it. The audience that this writer was writing to was brought up in Jewish traditions. They would have had a deep understanding of the Old Testament. They would have probably memorized portions of the Old Testament. They would have held dearly to the Jewish concepts of temple and priests and festivals and sacrifices and rituals. These people were very Jewish. And so the writer of the letter, Hebrews, would have had the same problem of the missionary in PNG. How do I explain the story of Jesus to people who have got a very specific Jewish context? And so the writer had to shape Hebrews in a way that made sense to them. And that's important for us to realise when we read Hebrews. It's almost like that if we don't understand that this was written to Jewish people in a very Jewish context, then we're not going to understand what Hebrews is trying to say either. But if we can have a little bit of understanding of the context of this book, about the Jewish context, then Hebrews suddenly has much more depth and profoundness than it might have had before. So I'm going to just jump in and, as I said, we're just going to dip our toes, but we're going to have a look at this book of Hebrews, go and have a look at some of the lines in Hebrews chapter 1 and see if this approach is helpful for you. So let's start off with some basic facts about the letter. Who is the author of the book of Hebrews? Well, this is the first issue that we run in. We don't know who the author of Hebrews is. Initially, people suggested it was Paul who wrote the book of Hebrews because Paul wrote a lot of the New Testament. And it sort of contains some Paul-like thoughts. And so people said it must be Paul. But Paul signed his name on everything that he wrote. He was not ashamed about his writing and actually would say, I, Paul, wrote this. And there's no indication in Hebrews anywhere that Paul signed his name. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 23 gives us a hint when the writer says that he saw Timothy, or that they saw Timothy as a brother, suggesting that the writer could be someone like Barnabas or Apollos or Silas or Philip, all who had a relationship with Timothy. Actually, some modern day research is suggesting that possibly a woman wrote Hebrews, someone like Priscilla or Lydia, who were very strong and significant leaders in the early church, both from Jewish backgrounds, and maybe the fact that the book is unnamed was because of the cultural difficulties of putting a woman's name to a book back then. The point is, we really don't know why, we really don't know who the person was who wrote the book of Hebrews, except for that they were Jewish and had a very clear understanding of the Jewish and traditions and the Hebrew writings of the Old Testament, and the fact that they also knew Timothy. So when was it written? Probably around about 70 AD. They suggest there's a lot of references to the Jewish temple in the book of Hebrews, and so the Jewish temple got destroyed at the end of AD 70, so it probably wasn't after the Jewish temple was destroyed, but the way that it was written suggests it was written later after Jesus, but probably before the destruction of the temple, which is why we say it's probably around early AD 70. Who was it written to? Well, that's the easy one. It was written to the Jewish Christians scattered across the known world. And I think this is the point that we have to get if you're reading Hebrews. Hebrews is written to Hebrews people. Hebrews is written to people who are from a Jewish context, a Jewish background, people who have grown up with the Jewish religion. And as I said before, it's a good example of what contextual theology is all about, taking the message of Jesus and relating it or shaping it in such a way that a particular group of people can understand it. So let me give you some examples, and this is where we're going to step through some of the verses of Hebrews chapter 1. And if you have it open in front of you, you might find that helpful. So let's start. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and various ways." Now, even in that first sentence, the writer is highlighting the importance of the Jewish culture and history. It's almost like they've gone, who are two really important groups of people that I need to acknowledge if I'm talking to a Jewish audience? And so he talks about the forefathers. In a Jewish context, the forefathers are, in particular, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, but also forefathers are referred to the people who have gone before them. Because genealogy is really important to the Hebrew people. So the writer acknowledges right up front, God has spoken to our forefathers. But he also says, I keep saying he. It could be a woman who wrote Hebrews. I apologise for that. They also say that the prophets, God spoke to the prophets. And that's another really important group of people to Hebrew people. People like Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah. They held these prophets in high regard. So right up front, the writer acknowledges that God has spoken a powerful way through these people. And you could almost imagine the Jewish audience nodding their heads going, yes, we agree with that. That is part of the core of who we are, that God has spoken to our forefathers and to the prophets. But then in verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2, the writer adds, "But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son." And this is almost in the first two verses of Hebrews, the writer is setting up what Hebrews is all about. That yes, God has spoken through the forefathers, the ancestors, and through the prophets. But God has also spoken to us through Jesus. And it's almost equating the importance of Jesus with these other two important groups of people that the Jewish people understood. Can you see what the writer's doing? Using an understanding from their culture, the ancestors and the prophets, and then bringing in the new concept of Jesus and saying Jesus is equivalent to these important people. It's contextual theology. And another way that the writer does it in chapter 1 is by quoting the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. There are 7 direct quotes in chapter 1 in 8 verses from the Old Testament. Actually, the writer uses 30 direct quotes in the book of Hebrews complete. It's almost like he's going, I know the importance of the Old Testament, of the Hebrews writing to you. So I'm going to quote for it so that you can see that I'm linking in what you find important, the Scriptures, to the message that I'm trying to say. Can you see how clever this book is? The writer knows the audience and is linking in the stuff that's important to them with the message that he is trying to say about Jesus. Now, if we were going to do this properly, I would actually keep going through line by line from Hebrews chapter 1, looking at these quotes from the Old Testament, maybe looking up where these quotes come from in the Old Testament, do some cross-referencing, and seeing what the context of those quotes mean to what the writer is trying to say in chapter 1. If we did that, phrases such like flames of fire or oil of joy, which don't make a whole lot of sense to us because we're not from a Hebrew context, but made sense to them because they were from a Hebrew context. If we look up the Old Testament, they might make sense to us as well. I'm not going to do this tonight, but if that's the sort of exegesis that you would like me to do, sort of digging around that sort of way, I'm happy to do that for us. I'm just trying to be led a little bit by you with this. But rather, I just wanted to finish off this time by continuing looking at the bigger picture of Hebrews and the context of that. Because this idea of what the writer is doing, taking the understandings of the Jewish people and the Jewish cultures and what's important to them and linking that to the message of Jesus, doesn't stop in chapters 1 and 2. It goes all the way through Hebrews. For example, in chapter 3, the writer compares Jesus and Moses together. Moses is one of the most significant people in the Jewish history. And the writer connects Jesus and Moses together. In chapter 4, there's a reference to the 10 Commandments and how on the seventh day we are to rest. He's using that concept and then links it into the way that Jesus also has come to bring us rest. In chapters 5 through to 8, there is a deep dive into the Jewish understanding of the temple, of sacrifices, of covenant, and of the holies of holies, and the role of the high priest. It actually goes for about 5 chapters, and the writer goes in deep in this. But as in doing it, like there's a whole chapter about I can't even say his name, Melchizedek. Gee, I should be doing better than that. Melchizedek. Yeah, I'll put it on the screen. You can work out how to say it. But he's one of the most famous high priests in the Old Testament. And the writer turns around and describes, the system of high priests. And it says, but now we have an even greater high priest. Somebody whose sacrifice is not a temporary sacrifice, but an eternal sacrifice. And links that high priest with Jesus. That Jesus is now the great high priest. Can you see this contextual theology? It makes perfect sense to the people he is talking to because that's what they grew up with. That's what they understand. The high priest, the sacrificial system, all of that stuff. And then even in chapter 11, when the writer is talking about faith in God, what does the writer do? If you know Hebrews chapter 11, it's all about the heroes of faith. And he goes back and runs through basically the history of the Jewish people, talking about the heroes of faith by talking about these people in the Old Testament. David, Ruth, he just goes through the whole lots of them. As I said before, it's a really good example of what contextual theology is all about. The purpose of the letter is more than just to remind the Hebrew people that, their history is important, or that, their culture is important. But what the writer's doing is taking these important things to them and linking it with the message that he wants to share, that they want to share with the Hebrew people, which is about Jesus. The goal of Hebrews is to reveal the true identity and purpose of God's own Son, the Christ. That's what the writer of the Hebrews is about, but using the context of the Jewish culture and religion to do that in. This is all summed up in chapter 2, verse 9, where the writer says, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honour, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. One of the articles I was reading about Hebrews said a good word to sum up Hebrews is the word superior. Superior. That Jesus is superior. Whether it's the high priests, Jesus is the great high priest. Whether it's the understanding of sacrifices, Jesus brings the perfect sacrifice. Whether it's the understanding of how God speaks through people, through the prophets and through the ancestors, Jesus is the ultimate way that God speaks to us. Can you see this idea that the writer is sort of saying, if you want to find the best, the superior one, it's Jesus. Look to Jesus. Well, I don't know if that's been helpful tonight. I know I've been doing big picture stuff, but that's what a little bit of this exegesis exploration is all about, is understanding the concept. As I said, this is a bit of a taster, and you can decide where we go from here. If you're going, hey, this is great, I want to learn more of this, then I'm happy to do more exegetical preaching. Maybe we can go through Hebrews line by line, or maybe there's another book of the Bible that you want to, do a deep dive into and have an in-depth look at the text. For example, I've actually once preached a 12-week sermon series just on the 5 chapters of 1 John. Or maybe you're going, nah, this is not the sort of teaching or preaching that I'm looking for in church, and I'd rather explore a deep dive into an issue rather than a passage. As I said, I'm really keen to hear what you think. And maybe you can write it in the comment section, whether you're watching this live or later. Just write in, I enjoyed that. I'd like more of that sort of type preaching, or I want to know more of Hebrews, or nah, that's not for me. Or if you'd rather not put it in the comment section, send me a direct message. I'd love to hear your comments. But to finish with, whenever I preach, it's more than just a teaching time. It's not just a tutorial or a lecture. There's also, we're supposed to be reflecting about how we implement some of this stuff in our own lives. Preaching has to inspire a response. And so I just wanted to finish with the challenge of contextual theology. You see, if the writer of the Hebrews, whoever that was so effective in being able to, who am I speaking to, what is their context, and how is the best way that I can explain the concept of Jesus to them, then maybe we need to think of how do we speak about Jesus? How do we have spiritual talk or raise the topic of spirituality with people? I know it's hard nowadays. We don't think anybody's going to be interested, or, we think that spirituality is a personal part of our life that shouldn't be shared, or maybe we just don't want people to think we're weird, or maybe we don't want to offend anybody. So we think, all right, if we don't want to offend anybody, we won't say anything. But I wonder whether some of the offence when we start to talk about spirituality comes from the fact that we're not thinking about the other person, and we're not contextualising what we're trying to say towards the other person. I think maybe some people might be more open to talk spirituality if we've actually taken the time to find out who they are and speak in a way that makes sense to them. For example, I think that a lot of people today would struggle with the concepts of sin and forgiveness and reconciliation. I know that from conversations that I've had. As soon as you start talking about sin, people tune out and they just go, nah, not interested. But if we were shaping the message of Jesus to talk about how Jesus was a person who wanted to bring light into the world, who wanted to make this world a better place, a more just place, a more sustainable place, that's a message that connects much better with people. And maybe we need to think about the context of how we're sharing our faith. And that might make that easier, sharing faith easier. So it's my prayer for tonight that we can all take up the challenge of contextual theology, that we might be brave enough to give it a go with the people around us. Amen.